You've probably heard of placebo effects. This is when we can feel better after receiving a fake treatment like a sugar pill. For decades, placebo effects have been discounted as irrelevant to the field of medicine. But now we know better. Placebo effects are real, and in some cases they are more effective than expensive drugs. Unlocking how placebo effects work has been one of the more remarkable findings in recent decades, and it may be the key to a revolution in medicine. Hi, I'm Jo Marchant, a best-selling science author, and in the next 30 minutes I'll take you through some stories that are so full of surprises it's hard to believe they're true. We begin now with a woman who fractured her spine and who was only able to find relief by undergoing surgery. Let's start with a true story. It's about an older woman from Minnesota named Bonnie Anderson. In 2005, she slipped on wet kitchen tiles and fractured her spine. After the injury, she suffered severe chronic back pain. When I interviewed her, she told me that because of the pain, she couldn't stand up to do the dishes or play golf, which she loved, and that she found it hard to sleep. Desperate for relief, Bonnie took part in a trial of a promising new surgical procedure called vertebroplasty. With this method, surgeons inject medical cement into the fractured bone to strengthen it. The surgery often seemed to dramatically improve back pain within a few hours, with many patients returning to normal activity within days. That was true for Bonnie, too. She told me, "It was wonderful. It really took care of the pain. I was able to go back to my golfing and everything I wanted to do." A decade later, when I spoke with her, she was still delighted with the outcome. Bonnie's fractured spine was apparently healed. But here's the twist in the story. The surgery Bonnie received was fake. She just didn't know it. Her surgeons acted out the whole procedure. They gave Bonnie a local anaesthetic, read from a script, and even opened a tube of the cement so that its smell like nail polish remover filled the room. And they pressed on Bonnie's back to simulate the placement of the needle. But she never got the injection of cement. And she wasn't the only one. There were 131 patients in that trial. Overall, their pain and disability scores were cut almost in half, with some, like Bonnie, showing dramatic improvement. Remarkably, there was no difference between the patients who got the vertebroplasty and those who just believed they did. Their belief, it seemed, was as effective as the surgery itself. Cases like this raise important questions. When we're ill, can positive thoughts, emotions, and expectations make us better? Can they stop us from getting sick in the first place? These are controversial issues. On one side, there are many claims for the power of mind-body therapies, often from alternative healers. These range from easing pain and fatigue to downright miracle cures. I've seen claims from regenerating limbs using pure awareness to defusing emotional conflict to cure cancer. The idea seems to be that the mind can heal just about anything if we start thinking more positively. Fighting back against this position are the skeptics, often conventional doctors and scientists. They dismiss any idea of healing thoughts as deluded and often attack not just the claims themselves, but any attempt to even investigate the subject. One skeptical biologist described research on the mind-body connection to me as rubbish, tooth fairy science, and even morally offensive. Another called it quackademic medicine, asking, why would actively doing nothing have any active physiological effect? So there are very strong feelings on both sides of this debate. And perhaps that's not surprising because the stakes are high. Some believers are so convinced of the mind's power that they go far beyond the evidence, and people who desperately need medical treatment can die as a result. Yet determined skeptics attack any suggestion that the mind might play a role in health, meaning that we may miss out on what could be a powerful force in medicine. So, who's right? In this series, we're going to investigate both positions and explore whether our minds can heal us. Here's where I stand. I'm a science writer with a PhD in genetics and medical microbiology, and I believe that the medical treatments we put our trust in should be tested in rigorous trials. But I also think we should pay closer attention to the links between mind and body. We all know from experience that our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions affect our bodies, and do every day. If you step out into the road and are almost hit by a car, you feel a jolt of adrenaline and your heart starts to race. You could get turned on just by hearing your lover's voice and feel a sense of awe by looking up at the night sky, or retch violently at the sight of maggots in the trash. In researching my best-selling book, Cure, A Journey into the Science of Mind over Body, my aim was to take an open-minded but evidence-based approach to what the research really says. Can the mind influence physical health? If so, how might it work? What can the mind do and not do? To answer these questions, I spent several years tracking down researchers, doctors, and patients involved in cutting-edge studies and trials all around the world. My goal was to explore how the mind influences the body and how we can use the latest discoveries in our own lives. I'm still on that journey as new evidence comes to light. In this lecture series, we'll look at how the mind can influence the symptoms we experience and how it can affect the physical progression of disease. We'll consider how thoughts can shape our health in crisis moments and throughout our lives. We'll investigate whether meditation really makes us healthier and discover astonishing ways to fight disease. We'll also assess the limits of the mind and the dangers of untested therapies. And I'll share my personal experiences from being burned in a virtual reality ice canyon to visiting the religious sanctuary of Lourdes. By the end, I hope I will have empowered you to understand the role all of us have in our own health. Let's start by considering Bonnie's case. How could fake surgery fix her painful back? This is an example of a well-known phenomenon called the placebo effect, where people often feel better after receiving what they believe to be effective medical treatment, even if that treatment is fake. As strange as it might seem, placebos, from sugar pills to simulated surgery, can apparently benefit patients across many different conditions and types of treatment. This effect is the reason why new drugs and treatments are always tested against a placebo. The purpose is to make sure that any benefits are due to the treatment itself and not for other reasons. But it has traditionally been assumed that the placebo effect itself is either a statistical blip or a delusion. The argument goes that if someone feels better after a fake treatment, then they would have improved over time anyway. Or maybe they just think they feel better or say they feel better when nothing has actually changed. Back in 1954, an article in the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, stated that placebos simply comfort the ego of unintelligent or inadequate patients. Even today, that perspective is quite common. The placebo effect has been described as a myth, a failure, or, my favourite, the beer goggles of medicine. It's often seen as something irrelevant, if not downright harmful, a contaminating effect that can fool us into believing that treatments are effective when they aren't. From this point of view, the placebo effect is the very definition of something that doesn't work. If a promising therapy can't beat a placebo, it's thrown out. And yet, while statistical effects and eager-to-please patients are responsible for some of the improvements recorded in medical trials, they're not the whole story, not by a long way. There's now a whole field of research showing that something else, something big, is going on when we believe in a treatment. So, let's dive into placebo effects. How and why does receiving a fake treatment sometimes make us feel better? Let's begin with what has been described as the moment that the biology of the placebo effect was born. Placebo effects themselves have been known about for centuries, but in the 1970s, scientists discovered naturally occurring substances in the brain that ease pain. They're chemically related to opioid drugs such as heroin and morphine, so they were called endogenous morphine or endorphins for short. This was the first hint that the brain is capable of producing its own drugs. In fact, morphine and other synthetic drugs work because they mimic natural endorphins, binding to the same receptor sites on neurons to block pain-related signals in the brain. The discovery of endorphins caused a neuroscientist named John Levine to wonder whether placebos might work in a similar way. In 1978, he performed a crucial experiment on patients recovering from dental surgery. He gave them an intravenous infusion of saline, salt water, that they thought contained morphine. A third of the patients reported experiencing significant pain relief even though they'd received no drug. It was a classic placebo effect. Then, without telling them, Levine added to their IV drips a drug called naloxone, which blocks endorphin receptors. The patient's pain returned. In a second experiment, he gave them hidden naloxone first, before they received the saline. That time, they reported no pain relief at all. This was remarkable. What Levine had shown was that you could block the placebo effect with the drug naloxone. This proved that the pain relief wasn't just in the patient's minds. They didn't imagine it. Their belief in the treatment activated the same biochemical pathway that morphine would have. It was the first study to show that placebo effects work through measurable biological mechanisms. A whole new understanding of placebos was born. In one sense, perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that a thought or belief can produce a physical effect. But the idea that a belief could create a medically significant outcome similar to that of a drug was, and still is, difficult for many to accept. It means that if someone is given a placebo and feels their pain melt away, it isn't necessarily trickery or wishful thinking. They're not weak, gullible, or unintelligent or inadequate patients. Their pain is easing through the same biological mechanism as when they take pain-killing drugs. Since Levine's groundbreaking trial, and particularly since 2005 or so, thanks to advances in brain imaging techniques, a huge amount of research has further investigated the role of endorphins in placebo effects. Neuroscientists can now look inside our brains and see what happens when we take a placebo. Studies using positron emission tomography, PET scans, reveal a drop in available opioid receptors when people experience a placebo effect, proving that those receptors are being used. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI scans, show reduced pain-related activity not just in the brain, but in the spinal cord too, suggesting that placebos can turn down pain signals even before they reach the brain. Levine's work inspired another pioneer in this field to study placebos. His name is Fabrizio Benedetti, and he's a neuroscientist at the University of Turin in Italy. Benedetti has shown that you don't even need to take a placebo to experience a placebo effect. Our beliefs modulate our symptoms when we take real drugs, too. He's tested this by giving people open versus hidden infusions of painkillers. In these studies, some people know they're getting the painkiller, others don't. For example, in patients recovering from surgery, he either told the patient they were getting the drug, or he just added it to their IV drip without telling them. Benedetti found that a whole range of potent painkillers were far less effective when people didn't know they were getting them. To achieve the same level of pain relief, patients who didn't know they were receiving the drug needed a 50% higher dose, and some of the drugs didn't work at all. It's just the same with painkillers you might take at home. The relief you feel is the combined effect of two components: the direct biochemical effect of the drug, plus the effect of your belief in that drug. Both pathways activate the same receptors in the brain. Another of Benedetti's key findings is that there isn't just one placebo effect. There are many. What he means by this is that a placebo can trigger various different responses in your body depending on the circumstances. In one study, when patients who had previously received morphine later received a placebo painkiller, it activated their opioid receptors. But when patients had previously received a non-opioid painkiller that works by activating different receptors in the brain called cannabinoid receptors, receiving the placebo activated those receptors instead. This shows that placebos can work through at least 2 different neurochemical pathways, depending on previous experience and expectations. In other medical conditions, there are different mechanisms again. Benedetti has researched placebos for Parkinson's disease, which affects the nervous system. Parkinson's patients have tremors and trouble controlling their movements because of a lack of the neurotransmitter dopamine in part of the brain. Benedetti and others have shown that when these patients take a placebo, they experience a flood of dopamine, just like when, and sometimes as large as when, they take a drug. Benedetti is also researching altitude sickness. In a lab he built high up in the Alps, where the oxygen level in the air is just 2/3 what it is at sea level. To get there, you have to take 3 cable cars from the nearest ski resort. Out of the window, you can see snow-capped peaks for miles. Oxygen deprivation at this altitude can cause symptoms such as headaches, dizziness, and nausea. I visited Benedetti when he was carrying out tests on a volunteer named David. I watched David working out on a step machine while wireless electrodes attached to his scalp monitored his brain activity, and sensors on his chest tracked his vital signs, including heart rate and blood oxygen levels. After 15 minutes of exhausting exercise, during which his oxygen levels dropped, David continued stepping, but he was given supplementary oxygen to breathe. Or at least, he thought he was. In fact, Benedetti had tricked David and me. The oxygen canister was empty. It was a placebo. David wasn't breathing oxygen after all, just normal air. In this study, Benedetti compared the performance and physiology of 2 groups of volunteers at altitude, those who received the placebo oxygen and those who didn't. Overall, the placebo group suffered fewer symptoms of altitude sickness and their performance on the stepper improved. Benedetti found that this effect also works through a measurable biochemical mechanism. Not surprisingly, the amount of oxygen in the volunteers' blood didn't change. But those in the placebo group had significantly lower levels of chemicals called prostaglandins in their saliva, which are produced when oxygen levels are low. These induce a variety of physical changes, such as dilating blood vessels to help pump more oxygen around the body. They're also thought to cause the headaches, dizziness, and nausea of altitude sickness. So these are just a few examples of how beliefs can affect our biology. In fact, our brains have an entire inner pharmacy of molecules like endorphins, cannabinoids, dopamine, and prostaglandins that regulate our physiology and can create or ease symptoms. Many of the drugs we take piggyback on these pathways. What these studies of placebos in pain, Parkinson's disease, and altitude sickness show is that our minds can influence these processes too. One reason that placebo effects haven't been taken seriously by many scientists until recently is because they're elusive and changeable. They're hard to pin down in scientific studies. We've heard how in different situations, placebos can trigger different effects and mechanisms. And the proportion of people who respond to placebos varies too. Depending on the circumstances, it can range from 0 to 100%. In trials of one ulcer medication, 59% of a placebo group in Denmark felt significantly better, but only 7% did in Brazil. The exact same placebo can also have positive, neutral, or even negative effects, depending on what we're told about it. All of this has contributed to the conception of placebos as dodgy and unscientific, with results that don't seem to make sense. After all, there's nothing in a placebo, so how can one placebo be different from another? How can nothing be different from nothing? But this is looking at placebos all wrong. By focusing on the fake treatment, we're getting distracted. It's a hangover from the Western idea that you need a physical drug to have a physical effect. The crucial point here is that any change that occurs has nothing directly to do with the fake treatment. How could it? Placebos have no active ingredient. Instead, what matters, what triggers the biological change, is a person's psychological response to the placebo, what receiving that treatment means to them. And this can be influenced by lots of things. One key factor is expectation. How do we expect our condition to change or improve? This is different for everyone and depends on many factors, such as what we're told about a treatment, how optimistic we are in general, whether we trust the doctor, and our mood. Previous experience is also important. In other words, placebo effects can be learned and even boosted. If a particular drug has helped you before and you take a placebo that looks just like it, then that past experience can strengthen your positive expectation for the placebo, creating robust effects that can sometimes work as well as the drug itself. The characteristics of a placebo can also make a difference to our expectations. In general, anything that conveys the impression of a potent, effective treatment evokes stronger placebo responses. Studies show that big pills work better than small ones. Brand name pills work better than generics. 2 pills work better than 1. And the more we pay for something, the greater the placebo effect. For the same reason, invasive or elaborate treatments like sham surgery or acupuncture tend to trigger larger placebo effects than simple fake pills. We can see a nice example of this in a recent meta-analysis. That's a study that combines the results of lots of different trials. This one included more than 5,000 patients being treated for migraine, and it compared the effects of the various different placebos used in the trials compared to no treatment. Patients who received what they thought was Botox injected into their head reported the largest placebo responses. The next best was the intravenous injection of a fake antibody. Placebo antibodies taken orally or injected under the skin also worked, but were the least effective. Another big factor in the success of a placebo is social interaction. Studies have shown that regardless of what a treatment is, the human aspect of care makes a surprisingly big difference to how patients do. One trial looked at people with irritable bowel syndrome who were all given the same simulated acupuncture. This is a placebo version of acupuncture where the needles are inserted in the wrong places and don't fully penetrate the skin. These patients had significantly greater relief from their symptoms when their practitioner was warm and empathic compared to when they were cold and polite. Another study of acid reflux disease found a similar effect. This time, people received either a homeopathic remedy or a placebo. There was no difference in outcomes between the two. But the length of the appointment made a big difference. After a 20-minute appointment, 17% of the patients said their symptoms were at least halved. But after a 40-minute appointment, in which the therapist listened to the patient talk about their condition, that figure soared to 75%. The importance of care is something we'll examine later in this course. So in what conditions do placebos work best? When might our expectations help us to feel better? And when should we be heading straight for conventional drugs and surgery? Well, in general, placebo effects seem to be strongest at modulating the symptoms we experience. They are very good at influencing how we feel. That means they are particularly effective for pain, from the chronic joint pain of arthritis to the acute agony of a burn victim, as well as things like nausea, fatigue, itching, and wheezing. Large placebo effects are seen in psychiatric and developmental disorders, including depression and autism. Placebos can affect cognitive function, memory, and sleep. What can placebos not do? Well, there's little evidence that they alter the underlying physical progression of disease. Simply believing that we've received a beneficial treatment doesn't influence how a medical condition might take hold and develop in our bodies. For example, in Parkinson's disease, placebos temporarily ease symptoms, but don't fix the underlying problem in the brain. Although I should point out that neither, in this case, do the drugs. One study with asthma showed that a placebo helped patients to breathe more easily, but it didn't change an objective measure of their lung function. And there's no evidence that placebos can lower cholesterol, banish a serious infection, or influence the progression of a tumour. Remember Bonnie Anderson with her fake surgery? The placebo she received banished her pain and disability, but it probably didn't mend her spine. These are key limitations. Placebo effects aren't an all-powerful, protective magic that can keep us well in every circumstance. They only work in particular situations. But that doesn't mean they have no value for medicine. In fact, easing symptoms is a hugely important part of modern healthcare. Think about all those painkillers and antidepressants we take. So if placebos can help, this is great news because conventional drugs are not very good at treating symptoms like pain, fatigue, gut problems, and depression. What's more, some of the drugs we commonly use for these conditions can cause significant problems of their own, from side effects and addiction to how much they cost. So are the benefits of placebos large enough to be worth chasing? Yes. While there's lots of variability, placebos often rival drugs in their effectiveness. In Parkinson's disease, researchers have reported up to a 50% reduction in symptoms, about the same as a dose of the drug apomorphine. Meanwhile, a recent study treating itching in patients with dermatitis compared a hidden drug dose, in other words, a drug but no belief, with a placebo, a belief but no drug. The placebo worked better than the drug. More broadly, many drugs believed to be effective are turning out to work mainly through placebo effects. In 2008, the Harvard psychologist Irving Kirsch used the Freedom of Information Act to force the US Food and Drug Administration to share clinical trial data on antidepressants. The data showed that apart from severely ill patients, antidepressant drugs such as Prozac had little effect over and above a placebo. More recent analyses have confirmed this. Meanwhile, the Italian neuroscientist Benedetti, whom we met earlier, found that Valium, which is widely prescribed for anxiety disorders, has no effect at all unless patients know they are taking it. And evidence for the power of placebos continues to accumulate. A recent meta-analysis of different pain interventions, including 215 clinical trials and more than 40,000 patients, concluded that the placebo effect accounted for about 75% of the overall effective treatment. In other words, only 25% of the patient's pain relief was linked to the biochemical action of the drug. 3/4 of the relief was due to patients' belief in the treatment. In the United States, the placebo effect in clinical trials of painkillers seems to be getting even stronger, perhaps due in part to consumer drug advertising and the fact that trials are getting longer and more expensive. Both of these factors boost patients' expectations for the drugs they receive. Ironically, this also means it's getting harder for drug companies to get new painkillers approved because they must show that their drugs perform significantly better than placebos. In 2013, new painkillers tested in US clinical trials beat placebos by just 9%. These are the best new experimental treatments that Big Pharma could come up with. Patients had dramatic reductions in pain, but almost all of it was caused by their minds. Why, then, do placebos work so well? Why can thinking that a particular change is going to happen often make that change come true? Understanding this opens up a whole new way of thinking about our bodies and our symptoms, and points towards how we can harness placebos without fooling ourselves, both in medicine and in our own lives. We'll talk about these issues next time. I hope you enjoyed this sneak peek of my new series, The Power of Mind Over Body. If you'd like to learn more about all the ways that our minds can influence our bodies and health, be sure to stream the full series now on Wondrium.